Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on.
Deep in the Aspen Grove. This story takes place in August of 2013 in the mountains of southern Oregon. I'm a USAF Security Forces airman, military police. My girlfriend was at work, and as a swelteringly hot day began to turn into thunderstorms, my buddy Nick, who was also another military cop, and I decided to go explore some back roads and get out of the heat in town. Southern Oregon is crisscrossed with logging roads, some actively used and many totally forgotten and overgrown. Nick and I spent many of our days off starting on these roads that we knew, finding ones that we didn't know, driving for hours into the mountains, eventually navigating back to paved roads. On this particular day, with storm clouds building over the mountains, we set off on a road we had never been on and began the drive into the mountains. After driving around for an hour, we hadn't seen nor heard any signs of other people in the woods. We rounded a bend in the thick fir woods and emerged in a meadow that was totally surrounded by thick aspen groves. The meadow was perfectly flat and eerily still. We both noticed the strange stillness almost immediately. No birds, hardly any insect noise, no squirrels, and certainly no other people. On the far side of the meadow, right at the edge of the tree line, there was a picnic table. The table was very odd, however. It was painted a bright orange and was much larger than a typical picnic table in a park. Remarking on this, Nick drove through the meadow to get a closer look. I remember being apprehensive as we approached. The whole scenario was exceptionally strange, and the overall silence of the aspen grove was unsettling. Also, it was nearly impossible to see far into the trees as aspens grow extremely close together. When we parked by the table, I hopped out of the passenger seat of the truck to check it out. I'm not very tall, only about 5'5", and regardless, the table was ridiculously oversized and practically unusable. The seats were nearly at chest level, meaning I would have to climb up to even sit on them. As I was looking at the table, Nick called me over to the truck, and I noticed he was looking back into the aspens. At first, I couldn't see what he was looking at, but then I noticed a splash of color that was completely out of place in the thick trees. A small, one-man tent was set back in the trees about 50 feet from this strange table. I had an initial feeling of dread and felt certain that there was someone in the tent, and if we could see the tent, they could see us. There were no campgrounds in this area. No people, no main roads for miles. Surely someone camping so remotely would be, at the very least, a strange person. However, as we observed the tent, we didn't see any movement or hear any sounds coming from it, so Nick suggested I call out. I didn't want to, but I did. "Hey, anyone in there?" I yelled. No reply. Feeling completely on edge, Nick and I thought about driving away and leaving this strange area. But we began to fear the worst. What if there was a body in the tent? What if someone had been kidnapped? Foolish, I know, but we thought it all the same. After some debate, we decided to have Nick turn the truck around to drive away from the camp. Should we need to leave in a hurry, he would be waiting behind the wheel. With my heart pounding, I started walking through the trees towards the tent. I was totally keyed up, and my senses were on full alert. When I reached the campsite, several things struck me as odd. Backpacks were scattered all over the place. No fire had been built, no wood collected. The tent was literally full of backpacks and women's clothing. Full of dread, I turned to leave and tell Nick what I had seen. As I was leaving, I heard Nick start yelling, let's go, let's get the fuck out of here!" Not knowing why he was yelling, I ran back to the truck. When I broke out of the trees, I saw an old beat-up Ford Taurus on the road, blocking us from leaving the meadow. I immediately leapt into the passenger seat and Nick floored the gas pedal. The car was occupied by 2 men, and a third person was laying against the window in the back. As we drove across the meadow, the driver attempted to block us from the road, but Nick drove around them and accelerated the way we had come. I looked back and saw the car attempting to turn around on the narrow road, and Nick drove like a madman, and though I was honestly terrified that they would catch up, we hit the highway without seeing the car again. I still don't know if the person in the back was male or female. I called the state police and they promised to send a trooper out to check the scene. However, I received a call the next day from a trooper stating that the campsite, the backpacks, and the women's clothing was all gone, though we could tell people had been in the area. The strange table was still by the thick aspen grove. I have not returned to the area and do not intend to. Followed in Wolf Creek, submitted by 2 Cows. This happened about 6 years ago. I was 22 at the time, and I'm from a little town in the middle of nowhere called Wolf Point, Montana. I had just come home for my last summer after college and was planning on moving to Seattle before the fall. I had a summer job that I hated at a restaurant, and as much as I loved my mom and grandparents, I was ready to leave this place. My boyfriend was going to come up for a week, and we planned on taking my uncle's quads out to the wilderness, and then hiking along Wolf Creek to camp and just chill. I'm a workout fiend, but I hadn't done a lot of walking over semi-tough land in a while, and was looking forward to this. My boyfriend, let's call him Jacob, and I'll call myself Mark, he came up early on a Friday morning. He lived in Missoula, where we both went to school, and he drove up halfway the night before, stopped for a while, and then drove the rest of the way from Billings. Wolf Point is really in the middle of no fucking where. Anyway, Jacob got there and went straight to my house as I had to finish a breakfast-lunch shift. He got some more sleep after hanging out with my mom, who loved him to death, and I still think is mad at me that we're no longer together. I got off work, and we immediately began to get things ready. We got packs, food, little camping stoves, all that kind of stuff. And my uncle had hooked up a little trailer on my quad, so after loading up most of the gear, we had dinner with my mom and grandparents, and then went to bed early so we could get up early too. Everything was awesome, and we woke up around 5. Got some breakfast, double-checked our food and water and gear, and off we went. My mom's place is on the northern edge of town, so getting out to where we wanted to go was not a problem at all. Jacob had never ridden a quad, so I spent a lot of that morning helping him get the hang of things, and we spent at least an hour in a clear area that butted up against some farmland. Private properties dotted Wolf Creek here and there, but the farther north you go, the less people you're likely to see. We were skirting the creek and not following it per se because it's pretty windy and turning. At one point, we stopped for something to eat, and I think that's where someone saw us. We were just talking, and before we got going, Jacob told me he had something to tell me, and I asked him what. He told me he loved me for the first time, and we kissed. Looking back, I'm convinced someone from afar could see us in the distance and did not appreciate this gesture and began following us. I can't prove that, but it's the only thing that makes sense to me. We kept riding, and sometime in the early afternoon we stopped, stashed the quads under some trees, and covered them with a camouflage tarp. We were going to continue hiking north up the middle fork of Wolf Creek and camp near the water and just chill with some weed and a bottle of Jack Daniels. It was around 5 or so when we stopped and set up camp under some trees. We pitched our tent, gathered up a ton of dead wood for a fire, and then made something to eat on our little stoves. Jacob got a fire going, and we were just relaxing, sharing a bowl and sipping on the JD. The sounds of the wilderness at night were all around us, and we could hear coyotes off in the distance. It was so peaceful. As the fire died down, we turned in for the night. I was awoken around 2 to what sounded like footsteps, but I couldn't be sure right away. But I definitely heard twigs snapping and what I thought was breathing. The steps never came into the immediate camp. They just circled around and around. I didn't wake up Jacob, and I was going back and forth wondering if it was just an animal scouting us out or if it was someone out to bust us for being on their land or whatever. The more I listened, the more I decided it was something walking on 2 legs. Eventually, it stopped or went away, and I fell back asleep. We woke up, had some breakfast, and I never mentioned anything to Jacob, Maybe in retrospect I should have. We kept on hiking and did that for most of the day, stopping only occasionally to take some pictures and stuff of the things we found, and we're just goofing off, having a good time. Late in the day, we again found another good place to camp and set things up. This time, we just drank the booze and didn't fire up, and we talked into the night about what we were going to do now that we were out of school. He wanted to pursue a master's degree, and I just wanted to start working. As I mentioned, we were planning on moving to Seattle. We were so into talking about our trip there to scout out housing that I never noticed the footsteps again until they were just outside the light of the fire. Jacob noticed this time and said, "You hear that?" I said, "Yeah," and told him it was probably just an animal. A little while later, we heard more footsteps, and I thought maybe it was some deer or something, but it became clear it was human footsteps. Then we heard hoarse whispering, so we knew for sure it was people. I called out hello, but no one answered. "We've got some Jack Daniels and Cokes over here if you want to hang out," I said. Nothing, no response. And the footsteps started again and faded away. At this point, I wasn't scared, but I was a little bit uneasy. Jacob was taking it in stride and was cool, and a little while later we heard quads or something far in the distance, and I said it must have just been landowners checking on us or something. We went to sleep, and when we woke up is when things went downward quickly. I crawled out of the tent to see Jacob standing there, staring. "Mark, I think we need to leave now." I looked to where he was looking, and on a branch hanging over the creek, there was a noose dangling down, and a piece of paper was nailed to the tree. It said, "Faggots, get out." Spelled F-A-G-U-T-Z, and it looked like a little kid wrote it. We still got the message. Faggots, get out. My stomach dropped, and I looked at Jacob, who I could see was visibly shaken. Now, Missoula isn't a metropolis, but this kind of shit doesn't happen there. However, out here, being gay isn't always an accepted thing. "Let's go home, please," said Jacob. I said okay, and we got something to eat and quickly picked up camp. I took some pictures of the noose and sign on my phone and made a mental note of where we were. I was going to tell the police about it. We started back and were hiking faster than we did the day before. But I was cringing inside because I knew we had to spend another night out here before we got back to the quads. I was kicking myself for wanting to rough it, knowing that we'd be home faster if we just rode the quads all the way out here. We were roughly in the same spot as the first night, and I was not okay with staying in the same place, so we walked on for a little more in the dark. We decided to skip the fire and just eat and get some sleep so we could be up early and get out of there. I know we were both nervous, but we were tired too. We tried to have one person on watch while the other slept, but I ended up falling asleep too while I was supposed to be watching. It was about 2 a.m. again, and I woke up to the snapping twigs again, and this time louder voices. Whoever was out there now was not hiding the fact that they were there. I got out of the tent and called out again and listened. The footsteps stopped, and it was just the noises of the night. Then a harsh laugh off to my left towards the creek. I said hello again, and this time something splashed in the creek water. I fumbled for my flashlight and shone it around the few trees around us and saw nothing. Then, something was thrown towards us and it landed with a loud thump on the ground in front of me. I played my light on it. It was an old hatchet. I heard the voices again, and I stumbled back into the tent, crashing into it and on top of Jacob, waking him up. There was loud laughing around us, and a voice said, "Is that how you homos do it?" Now I was scared and angry. I got up, went over to the hatchet, and picked it up, yelling, "Leave us alone! We're just trying to go home." Jacob found his way out of the tent and was holding his survival knife. Honestly, we weren't kidding anyone. If there was more than a couple of people out there, it wouldn't have been much of a fight. It was quiet for a bit, then more footsteps and whispering, and I was shining the flashlight all over the place trying to see who it was out there in the dark. Then a woman's voice called out and said, "I guess you fags can't read. Get out!" I shone the light towards the voice, and while I couldn't see who it was in the dim light, against the sky between some trees, we saw 4 shapes. There were 4 people out there. "We don't want any trouble," I said. "We're leaving. Just leave us alone." They just stood there watching as we scrambled to pack up. We got our stuff together and started walking out of the spot, and this crazy laughter filled the air. We booked it into the night. We jogged all the way back to the quads and got to them when it was still dark out. All the while, we kept looking over our shoulders, terrified of what we might see. But there was no one there. We uncovered the quads, and we found that someone had dumped some kind of animal shit all over the seats and on the handlebar grips. We wiped it off as best as we could, and we just got the fuck out of there. The only time we stopped was at an outdoor car wash to power wash everything down. We got back to my house and went inside. It was about 6 in the morning, and my mother was just getting ready for work. We told her everything, and we called the police. They came out and took our statement, and I showed them the pictures of the noose and sign, and all the shit on our quads. I still had the hatchet that they had tossed at us. Nothing ever came of it, and Jacob went home later that day. He'd had enough. We both moved to Seattle and aren't together anymore, but are still really good friends. I've told the story over and over, and I know it's not as scary as a lot of the stuff you read, Uncle Josh, but this still bothers me to this day. Last weekend, some friends asked me if I wanted to go camping, and I said no. I'm a little soured on the whole camping thing. A scream in the night. I was just about 24 years old when my cousin Charlie got throat cancer. He wasn't really my cousin, he was my dad's cousin, but for whatever reason I always called him Cousin Charlie. Anyway, he and his wife lived up around San Luis Obispo, and when he was finally recovering from cancer, he went to stay in his estate in mainland Hawaii. At one point, he needed someone to babysit his home in San Luis, so I volunteered. Fast forward. I'm staying at his place by myself, and we're talking satellite internet and television slower than a snail. I found myself enthralled in the Lord of the Rings marathon and proceeded to stay up until around 2:30 in the morning. Changing the channel meant whatever channel I was clicking meant it would choose 4 stations down from my selection, so I was hesitant to change the channel. The marathon ended, and I proceeded to make some green tea. And that's when I heard it. A distant scream, calling across the valley below. I knew it was a human scream, but for some reason I just refused to believe it. The thing about houses inland from San Luis is that you have a lot of room between your neighbors, and we're talking 2 miles apart from each other. If someone was playing music on the other side of the hill, you had no problem hearing it. I thought maybe the person screamed because they were watching a scary film, or perhaps they were playing a board game. I really don't know. I just did my best to imagine it was me over-exaggerating. About 2 minutes went by, and I passed it off at this time, getting lost in infomercials. That's when I heard something familiar to a firecracker, but then I heard it multiple times. Something didn't seem right, so I grabbed the nearest blunt object and headed upstairs. My cousin Charlie has a 360-degree second deck, which I proceeded to go to and take watch over with a fire poker. Like that would do me any good. I listened, but I could only hear the wind. I would later end up falling asleep in one of the rocking chairs, and then waking up about 40 minutes later. What I later found out from my cousin Charlie is that a man had gotten into a big argument with his wife and shot at her as she ran from the house. I also later found out that because I was the only one who had left the outside lights on, she was running towards me, but died from her wounds about 60% of the way over. This still gives me chills. The Trail Guide. Tennessee has some real bumfucky people out in nature. I hiked all around while at school there, and made some good memories with a girl in the enveloping nature. Tennessee has good roads to popular hiking sites, and tons of mini trails branching off. Sometimes you need to know what to look for as far as trail markers go, because the interesting ones are always a good ways out. There was this one trail that had a spring waterfall that spilled across a mossy granite wall, towering over a shallow stream that empties into a decent-sized pond. I went out there with a friend last time, and we got separated on the way out. I have no fucking clue how this happened. We've each been hiking for over 10 years, and I've run it over 1,000 times in my mind. It has to be this one ledge system. To get to the top of the falls, you need to take a longish detour that has a lot of old wooden railings and a 3-way branching ledge system. So I've taken all 3 routes and ended up at the same spot. And they take maybe 3 or 4 minutes to blast through, and they're kind of like rocky corridors. I don't take the left one anymore because I'm 90% sure these big stains in the middle are blood. I don't want to know what happened there. And it's odd because the left is by far the most inviting. Flowers blooming from vines that are etched into the moss-matted bedrock. Anyways, I'm 45 seconds ahead of her, and I opt for the right path when I realize I should tell her to avoid the left. It's really hard to reverse, given the sloping angle of the path and a few short drops that become narrow climbs. Fuck it. Faster if I speed through and then just yell down. I get out of the right corridor, swing around to where the middle path drops off, yell, and there's no reply. She must have taken the left. I run over and climb into the left corridor, thinking that she saw the stains and freaked out. I mean, it really looks like someone got bludgeoned to death, to be fair. She was fucking gone. Ashley? Nothing. And that's what made my hairs stand up. I literally heard nothing. No birds, no hum of the forest, not even wind. Just myself and the babbling water. I traced left all the way back and noted a few side passages if you miss a couple of the jumps. No bodies were in there, or the middle though, which was good. I figure I might as well go to the top of the falls where I can get somewhat of an aerial view. And I get there, and Ashley is there waiting for me. She says she took the left path with the trail guide. What? There are no trail guides. There are rangers, but she knows the difference. They wouldn't be in the rock labyrinth. She said this guy had a uniform on and a trail authority visor. She knew what I was thinking based on my face, and agreed that we should reverse course ASAP without us saying anything out loud. Man, it's weird when you know you're being watched. So, yeah, we pretend we're going back to the car real quick to get more water, and so I left some fish food in a little crevice like I always did, and we left. She showed me this weird side passage that could not have existed a year before. I walked all the way around. You had to crouch, but you could walk through the labyrinth if you kept left. In hindsight, we should have taken another way. I think this guy lives in those tunnels. She said he kept trying to lead her in different directions, but she just followed the light and saw him standing in the tunnel as she walked the rest of the trip to the top. That means he was there when I was looking for her. That means she followed him before seeing the blood splatters or whatever all over the floor and walls. And that's not the totally fucked part. The fucking fish food was on the hood of my car. And her water bottle was gone too. She had it carabinered to her pack, so he must have snuck up and taken it at some point. We hiked fast too. Never went back, and will not. In the Middle of Nowhere by Queen Beatrice II. September 2010, my boyfriend Dave, his best friend Tony, and my best friend Liz and I were all coming back to our hometown after our final year of college, after spending the summer in London. We'd had a fantastic time staying in my uncle's apartment, partying and exploring such a big city. It was great. We'd stopped to stay at a B&B the night about halfway home, and we were planning to get home around 6 p.m. We all woke up early, around 4 or 5, ready to set off again, when we discovered that someone had obviously driven too close to our car and broke the right wing mirror off. Seeing as how it was my dad's birthday present to me and I'd barely had it 2 months, I was absolutely fuming. We asked the landlady where we could possibly find spares or something to use for the time being, and she said she'd driven past a makeshift scrapyard or something a while back. She wasn't sure if it was still there, but she drew us a rough map, and we got back on the road. I wasn't very sure she was right about her directions, because the closer we got to the area she'd circled it in, the more desolate the surroundings were. The roads got more difficult and had gone from stone to dirt, and around us there weren't any farms anymore, just long, weedy grass and patches of forest. It had basically become a moor. We were about to head off because of the wild animals, and I'd just have to get over being a paranoid driver and deal without my wing mirror, when surely enough, my boyfriend pointed out to a handwritten sign that was directing us 2 miles down the road to Cafe and Car Spares. We drove down into a little cove surrounded by forest, and we all got out, except for my friend Liz, who was asleep in the back seat. There was a tiny cream hut with cafe spray-painted on the roof, a caravan, and a hill of metal and bits of cars. As to be expected, we were the only visitors parked up in front. The sun was up, but no lights or people were around, and I guess they were still sleeping. It was around 6 anyway. We all walked up to the scrap pile, and I had a fumble through, looking for a wing mirror or any sort of mirror that could do for the time being until I could get mine repaired. Tony picked up what had to have been at least a decade-old mirror and suggested we just take it and go. But me, being stupid and sincere me, insisted I have to give them some money for it. I can't just take it and go. So I knocked on the door and waited. A big, hard-faced man opened the door, and at first he looked pissed off and tired. But then he smiled at me, a two-toothed smile. He leered at me for a few seconds, and then, seeing the boys approach, asked us what we wanted. Tony handed him the mirror and asked how much, and he said nothing, just to get to know us, to which I thought, fair enough. 2 more men then left the patio door on the other side of the place. They turned and smiled, both skinheads with teeth like meth addicts, and they came over. Oh, they stank. He gave them the mirror and told them to go attach it to our car. He then introduced himself as Ian, sat us down on the patio chairs, and offered us some sandwiches. I politely declined, but he insisted we must be hungry and told me to come in and that women are the best at making sandwiches. I declined again, finding him a little bit sexist at this point. When he asked again, Dave, more sternly, reinforced that I said I didn't want to come in. Ian muttered something, and then came and sat on the chairs with us. It became awkward very quickly as he started asking us questions. It started off innocently, like asking how old we were, where we were from, etc. But then it became a little uncomfortable. He asked if I had a boyfriend, to which Dave answered. And then he started asking us both what we like to do to each other, how often we have intercourse, and weird private stuff like that, to which we didn't answer. We just sat in silence, until we heard Liz scream. When we turned around, I saw one of the men that was supposed to be fixing the mirror with his hand in the back window grasping Liz's leg. The other was looking around nervously behind the car. We got up immediately and sprinted off the patio. Tony was running after the guys, but they both headed into the forest. Liz was hysterical. She'd woken up to find herself on her own in the car and a man's hand running up her leg. I can't even imagine how terrifying that must have felt. So I got into the back seat with her and consoled her while Dave came around the other side to get in and told us some nails were on the floor. We looked over, and there were about 12 of them arranged around the tire, like the guy was ready to pop them. I couldn't really think why at the time, but now I wonder where they got all those car parts. We decided that was enough. We didn't want to spend any more time there, mirror or no mirror, and we were ready to go when Tony was the last one to get in the car. He closed the back seat door, and as we looked back and saw Ian re-emerge from the house with something long in his hands, he was running towards us. My vision adjusted when he got a bit closer, and then I realized he was holding a rifle. A fucking hunting rifle. At that point, I actually burst into tears and hit the engine, slamming on the accelerator as hard as possible. The car started to go, and we got up to about 90, forgetting the dirt roads and just driving over whatever until that scrapyard was out of sight. We didn't stop looking behind us until we were safely on the motorway getting home. To this day, whenever I go to London, I take a train. I'm still terrified I'll meet them again. The House, submitted by Jason T. When I was in my early 20s, my friends and I would go to a lot of concerts at this venue that was kind of out in the boondocks. Getting in and out was always a pain in the ass, as the system of parking was kind of crazy. We always complained about it, and one day a mutual friend told my friend Toby and I that there was an abandoned house not too far away from the venue. He told us that he had parked there a lot, and if it was not raining, you could just walk through some fields and end up in the parking lot of the place. After any concert, he would just walk back through the field, get into his car, and get on the road. We were going to a very popular band that I'm not going to name, and I asked Toby maybe we should try this. We were going to take our girlfriends, and to make sure that it was legit, we went out a couple of days before the show to scope out the entire scene. And our buddy wasn't lying. There was an abandoned house not too far, maybe a quarter of a mile walk through some grassland, that led right to the parking lot of the venue. We high-fived and said this is a great place, and we won't have to worry about waiting in line to get in or get out. We even found a spot to park where we could tailgate before the show. Funny thing is, we didn't bother looking in the house, which we probably should have, and would have caused us a heck of a lot of less trauma. But we were too excited about having a spot to chill before meeting up with friends in the main parking lot for some more tailgating, knowing that we were going to have an easy way to get back home after the show. I drove my car out to the spot, and we set up a grill, we threw a frisbee around, and just had some pre-concert beverages and enjoyed an afternoon. A couple of hours before showtime, we got everything cleaned up and made our way over to see our friends in the main parking lot. Easy peasy. Walking through the grass was a snap, and we kept talking about how awesome this was, but how we also needed to keep it hush-hush so other people wouldn't try doing it. In the back of my mind, I also knew that what we were doing was highly illegal, as this was not our property, and we were probably not supposed to be out there. But, oh well, such is the folly of youth. We had a great time with our friends, and the show was spectacular. And afterwards, we hung out for a little while and then made our way back to the abandoned house where my car was. This is where things get freaky. We got to my car and everything was fine, but Toby noticed there was a light on in the house. And I immediately thought, oh shit, someone's here and we're all in deep trouble. I thought maybe we should knock on the door and apologize to whoever was inside and maybe give them some money for being idiots and parking on their property without asking permission. I grabbed a 20 from my wallet and Toby gave me one too, and we walked up to the front door. He knocked and we waited, and nothing happened. But then the light that was on in the upstairs room turned off. We knocked again and called out, "Hello, is there anyone home? We're sorry for disturbing you. We'd like to apologize." No response. So, being a few more than a couple of beverages deep, Toby turned the knob on the front door, and it swung open. We went inside and called out again, "Hello, is there anyone home? We're sorry to disturb you." It was dark and I turned on the flashlight of my cell phone. I showed it around in the room the door opened into, and there were nothing but 5 or 6 mannequins. It was really creepy. I called out again, "Hello?" And we thought we heard someone upstairs. The floorboards were creaking. I went back to the staircase where the front door was and looked into another room, and it also had a bunch of mannequins. I need to stress that they weren't just standing up. There were mannequins sitting in chairs, there were mannequins looking out the windows, and I kick myself to this day for not taking pictures, but we were so creeped out, we wanted to just get the heck out of there. I yelled out that I was going to leave the $40 on the floor and that we were sorry to disturb anyone who might be there. And that's when we heard a door smash open upstairs and footsteps come running downstairs. However, it wasn't the staircase that we were at. It sounded like a staircase that was in the back of the house. In the light of my cell phone flashlight, we saw a guy with really long hair, a pair of jean shorts and no shirt, come into the living room we were standing next to. He had a bat in his hands and a crazy look on his face. I kind of thought he was frothing at the mouth, to be honest. Without one word to us, he started smashing all the mannequins apart with the bat. Toby just yelled out, "Oh shit!" and we started to back up to leave the house. I grabbed his arm as the guy ran through some rooms in the back that we obviously hadn't seen, and then he started smashing the mannequins in the other room. He then stopped, looked up at us, and said, "You need a room for the night?" He was standing there sweating and panting, and like I said, it looked like he was frothing at the mouth. We just said, "No, we left you some money. Sorry about all this." And we ran out to my car, jumped in, and hauled ass out of there. I looked back, and I could see the guy standing in the doorway with lights that were now on in the house. He didn't chase us, and he didn't come after us with an axe or anything like that. We knew we had screwed up, and we just wanted to get out of there. Our girlfriends were wondering what the heck had happened, and we told them as we drove home. Jump to 10 years later. Toby and I were still friends and going to see another concert at the same venue. This time we were by ourselves, as our girlfriends were now our wives, and they were taking care of the kids, and didn't have any desire to see the same band that we had dragged them to a bunch of times. Being smarter adults, we parked in the main lot and had a great time at the show, and were gearing up to be waiting in line to get out of the place, knowing we both had to go to work in the morning. Toby looked at me and said, "Hey, rather than just sit here, we should go back and check out that house." I told him he was crazy, but he convinced me that we should go and look to see if anything had changed. Knowing that there was not going to be much to do other than sit around and have another beer or two before the lot started to empty and people could actually get back on the highway, I said, "What the hell, let's go see." We walked through the grass the same way that we had done before, and there, lo and behold, was the same house. It looked exactly like it had years ago. Toby said we should go inside, and I said, "No way, man." So instead, we just kind of went up to the windows of the living room we so long ago had seen a guy smashing mannequins apart with a bat. I again turned on the flashlight of my cell phone, and I kid you not, the room was full of mannequins again. Whatever happened to the other ones, I have no idea. There was no mess or shattered remains. I mean, it had been 10 years, but there were just more mannequins standing and sitting in the room. Being as curious as I was, I ran around to the other room where we saw the other mannequins the last time, and it was the same thing. More mannequins. I said to Toby, "We really need to get out of here, man. I'm totally creeped out." He agreed, and as we were walking off the property back to the grass field between the venue and this place, we heard a scream come from the house and saw the upstairs lights go on. We didn't stick around to see what was going to happen. We just hauled ass back through the grass to my car and grabbed a beer, totally freaking out. Neither of us has been back to that house. I have no idea who that guy was. I have no idea why our friend thought it was abandoned when it clearly wasn't. And I have no idea why the person who lived there had all those mannequins set up. And it was really, really creepy. We just sat there calming down and sipping a beer waiting to hit the road. Toby brought something up that I had never thought about. The time that we were out there with our girlfriends, was someone sitting in the house watching us while we were just tailgating, waiting for the show to start and see our other friends? I mean, to me, that's just as weird as all those mannequins, and a guy who looked clearly out of his mind smashing them to pieces with a bat in front of us. I can only thank the Lord that that's all that happened to us, and that we got out of there safely both times. Family Cabin, submitted by Keep It Real Keel. My name is Keel. Yeah, that's my real name. My grandparents were from England. I know it's unusual, but I'm proud of it, and I like it, and it has nothing to do with this story. My family owned a cabin in an extremely remote part of upstate New York. Even if I told you where it was and gave you directions, you probably would never find it. It's a great retreat for our family, and we like to spend as much time there as possible, even though I'm now a grown man with kids of my own. To get to it, you have to take a road that doesn't even have a name. It's just one of those route so-and-sos. And at an intersection where there's no light and just stop signs, there's a general store in front of it. You take a dirt road to the right that winds up through the hills up to where our place is. When I was growing up, There were a lot of other people who had cabins there, but for whatever reason, they all stopped going in the 90s and 2000s when I was spending a lot of time there as a young adult. The places are still used and were used at the time as hunting lodges, but no one was really out there outside of hunting season anymore. This story is about a time that my best friend Mark and I took our girlfriends Kelly and Monica up to our cabin for a long weekend. We got all our stuff together and made the hour-long drive out to the middle of nowhere, and once we got there, the girls got bathing suits on and went to the edge of the pond, which sits right at the front of our cabin. There's a little bit of what I would call a beach, but nothing like when you go to the ocean. Just some sand and rocks, a place to lie out in the sun. Mark and I checked the generator and got the rest of our things set up that we needed to. Lots of unloading coolers and so. I need to point out that our cabin is elevated from the road that you take to get to it, so it's about a half-mile down our private road to the dirt road that takes you back to the general store. We were hanging out on a Thursday afternoon, just having fun in the sun. We all decided to take time off from our summer jobs and just hang out and enjoy our company, knowing that in another month and a half we would be going back to college. As I mentioned, it's a very hard place to find, so seeing or hearing other vehicles or people is extremely rare. Mark and I were having a beer and talking baseball when I saw a white vehicle driving down the dirt road. At first I didn't think anything of it because, hey, it's a public road and everyone has access to it. And it also led to some other fire roads down the way where I know people sometimes went camping. But about 20 minutes later, the same vehicle was driving back the other direction towards the little hamlet where the general store was. Again, I mentioned it to Mark, but, who knows? Somebody out for a drive or somebody's camping out there. No big deal. Who cares? It was getting on in the evening, and we decided to grill some steaks, and the girls wanted to get cleaned up. And to be honest, I cannot believe how big of troopers they were having to wash in the pond with biodegradable soap. No running water out there. Their only stipulation was that we couldn't watch. And ha, of course we did. We're guys. We're pigs. It was at that point when I was grilling that I looked over the girls in the pond and saw the same white vehicle slowly going down the road. I grabbed a pair of binoculars we always kept in the front of the cabin to look out at birds and whatnot, and I got a glimpse of the truck just in time before it went behind some trees. It was one of those old Ford Broncos, like the one O.J. made his famous drive in. I mentioned it to Mark, and he said, yeah, it's probably somebody who's just coming back from the general store. But something in my stomach told me that maybe something else was going on. I didn't want to jump to conclusions and freak anybody out, though. We made dinner and had a really good time, just talking and planning out a campfire. Even back then I was part of the campfire crew. Mark and I had a couple of beers, and the girls were drinking some wine, when I happened to look up and saw the truck driving in the opposite direction that it had come from before earlier. Again, I grabbed the binoculars, and it was the same Ford Bronco driving the other way slowly. Now I was starting to think something was up. Yeah, maybe it was some campers that kept forgetting supplies and were going to that little general store. But it seems odd that I'd seen that same Bronco that many times in the afternoon, and not one other car. I didn't say anything to anyone, and the night wore on and we all were just listening to music and enjoying the fire. Eventually, we all got tired and decided to hit the hay, and let the fire burn down, and everyone went inside and got ready for bed. I would have to say it was about 4 a.m. that I woke up, which is not much earlier than I normally would get up back then. I was working construction and was usually up by 5:30. For whatever reason, I thought I would go out and get some air, and sneaked out of bed without waking up Monica. I walked as quietly as I could so as to not wake up Mark and Kelly, and I went out onto the porch. I was looking off to the east over the pond and was wondering when the sun was going to start to rise. I've always liked sunrises and thought if this is a good one, I would wake up Monica and we could just have coffee and watch the sun. I was, however, not looking off to my right and the west. Eventually, I did kind of pan over there, and there on our private road was the white Bronco. Whoever was inside obviously noticed me because they turned on the lights, started it up, and started backing down our road. For a minute, I didn't know what to do, but then I backed up inside, reached to the side of the front door with my left arm, and grabbed my Benelli. Without making much sound, I went back onto the porch, listening to this truck back up. I thought for a moment about walking up the road to make sure that whoever it was getting out of here,
but a cooler head prevailed, not knowing who the fuck was in that truck. I waited for a few minutes, and then saw the lights of the truck heading back down to the little hamlet, down the dirt road. Again, I didn't say anything to anyone and went back inside and started making coffee. I didn't want anyone to be afraid, but inside I was a little uneasy about some strange truck coming down our private road who obviously knew that we were there. After everyone had started breakfast, I made some lame excuse that I had to run to the general store and said I would be right back. I drove down and went inside and asked the proprietor, who had been there since the Stone Age, if he had seen a white Bronco in the little hamlet. He said he had, and I asked if the driver had been in to buy any supplies, and he said no, but I've just seen it driving by a whole lot. Then he asked why, and I let him know about what had happened. He turned around and slid a box of slugs over to me and said, "On the house," with a smile. I know he knew I wasn't going to shoot anybody, but his kind attitude made me feel good. I bought a couple of things and said I'd probably be back in another day or so, and that he was more than welcome to come up and visit if he wanted to. Nothing happened the rest of that morning, and we were just enjoying ourselves, lying in the sun, trying to catch the non-existent fish in our pond, and having a great time. I still didn't mention the truck to anyone. That afternoon, we were all having a swim, and I got out to go grab a couple of beers from the cooler on the porch of the cabin. When I turned around, of course, what do I see? The white Bronco driving down the road towards the other fire roads down the way. And now I was starting to get nervous and a little bit angry. I asked Mark if he wanted to go for a walk up to the road with me, and he said sure. The girls were just going to continue lying in the sun and getting tan. No one asked why I slung my Benelli over my shoulder. I think most of them were used to me doing that if they'd been out here with me before. I mean, Monica certainly was, and so was Mark. Kelly didn't say anything anyway. As we walked the half-mile or so down to the dirt road, I told Mark what I had seen the night before and asked him if we might consider not staying. He said no, maybe it was a guy who was just lost and didn't know what was going on, and maybe he was confused. Which I suppose is an okay thought. But why would he be up in front of the cabin with the engine and lights off if he were lost? I mean, wouldn't most people have just come up to the cabin and asked for directions to get out of there? We finally got down to the road and were standing there just talking about being safe, and if anything crazy happened, what our exit plan was. That's when we heard a vehicle coming. I told him we needed to fade up our private road and stand on the edges where the tall grass was. We did, and shortly after, that same white Bronco came slowly driving by. It slowed a little bit in front of our private road, but then continued on back towards the little hamlet. I immediately closed our heavy gate at the road. When we were out there, I usually left it open because it is heavy and it's kind of a pain in the ass to unlock and lock and hook up and unhook it. But now, after seeing that fucking Bronco, I decided it was a good idea. Mark said maybe we should tell the state police what was going on, and I said if this guy comes back again, I will do that. But I didn't want anyone staying up there by themselves or asking someone to go to the closest substation to do that. I was just hoping the truck wouldn't come back and we could enjoy the rest of our weekend. We were staying until Monday, and it was only Friday. We both decided to not say anything to the girls and just make the best of the rest of the weekend. The rest of that day was having a blast, so was the next day. I didn't see the Bronco again, and I had to add I was kind of making it a priority to look up at the road every chance that I got. No one came back up to the cabin as they obviously couldn't get through the gate. On Saturday afternoon, the girls wanted to go to a vineyard not too far from where we were to buy some more wine and do some shopping in a gift shop. We all piled into my truck and left for some girl stuff. We spent an hour or so wandering around the gift shop and then made our way back to the cabin. I remember Mark asking if I had closed the gate or not. And I had, but I hadn't locked it. When we pulled up, the gate was open. Without saying a word, Mark and I looked at each other, and we kind of gave each other that glance as if something's about to go down, we're in this together. The girls were too busy chatting to notice anything. When we got back up to the hill to the cabin, there was no one and no Bronco there. But I was still uneasy. We played some cards, and Monica could tell something was wrong after dinner, as I was obviously preoccupied with thinking about who was in that truck, why they were bothering us, and had they been in the cabin? We had another campfire that night, and as the night wore on, everyone was slowly falling asleep in their camp chairs after a couple of beers and a couple of glasses of wine. It was very peaceful out, and the stars were out doing their thing in full force. Super beautiful, but still butterflies in my stomach that something was wrong. Everyone started to get ready to go back inside, and I saw lights down in the dirt road. It doesn't take Einstein to put the connections together to know that it was the Bronco again. It was driving faster than it had been before, but then after a few minutes it came back going the other way, then did the same thing. It was a total of 3 trips. Everyone went into the cabin, and I told Mark to stay there and that I was going to go down and check on the gate. I didn't want the girls to be left by themselves if something was going to go on. And of course, we didn't say anything to them. We didn't want them to be scared. I grabbed my Benelli and a flashlight and walked down to the gate. The truth is that after we had gotten back, I knew that I had locked the gate, but I was going to stand there for a little while to see if that Bronco came back. Yep, it did come back. I was standing at one of the posts of our gate when I heard the sound of the tires coming. There was a little ditch on one side of our road to the cabin, and I hopped down into it despite there being a little bit of mucky water. In short time, the Bronco slowly came by our gate and slowed down even more. It almost came to a complete stop, and I jumped out of the ditch with my Benelli across my chest and yelled, "Who the fuck are you?" I thought whoever it was would immediately speed away, but the Bronco actually came to a stop and just sat there. The window was up and I couldn't see inside at all. Finally, the window came down a little, but in the darkness, I couldn't see who was at the wheel. All I heard was a deep voice say that, "Those are some fine-looking bitches you got." Then he hit the gas and sent up a spray of dirt and gravel and took off. I almost wanted to fire off a shot, but thought better of that. Shaking and pretty scared at this point, I made my way back to the cabin, went inside and washed my face and hands. Monica could tell something was wrong, and then I finally told everybody what had been going on. I wasn't sure if we should stay, but everyone said that they felt safer staying there until morning at least. And Mark and I said that we would take shifts and watch over things for the rest of the night. Of course, the girls weren't going to get much sleep either, so we just made the best of it as we could. The next morning, however, I went out to my truck and saw that one of my tires was completely flat. I mean, I can't totally blame it on Bronco Guy, but nonetheless, it was flat. So it took me some time getting the spare from the bottom of my truck and changing the tire. Seeing as how it was now Sunday, we just decided to head home and call it a weekend. We had spent most of the night talking about how creepy all of this was, and no one really wanted to stay, I could tell. Personally, I kind of did because I wanted to have a showdown with whoever this guy was in the Bronco. And on the outside of things, I was 100% positive he was the reason that my tire was flat. We packed up and started to head home when I needed to get some gas, and we stopped at the only place for miles around. I started to fill up the tank, and as I was standing there, I happened to notice the white Bronco drive by on the main road. I was determined to find out who he was, and finished up with the gas, jumped behind the wheel, and sped out of the gas station in the direction of the Bronco. I eventually caught up with it, but kept a good distance between it. I didn't want whoever was driving it to think that I was following. It didn't take long for it to stop. It pulled over into the vineyard. It went behind the main building and into a barn, and I told everyone to wait in the truck and went inside the vineyard. They weren't really open yet, but there was a woman behind the counter. Angrily, I asked, "Who the hell owns that Bronco?" The woman was taken aback and said it was hers, but that she rarely drove it and always kept it in the barn behind the vineyard. She asked why, and how I even knew there was a Bronco there. I gave her the short version of what had happened, and she said, "That's impossible. That Bronco never leaves my barn. I'm the only one who has the keys." She turned around and opened a drawer and held up a set of keys. Her husband and son came in, and she told them what I had just told them. Her son was about 11, so we can't jump to conclusions that whoever was driving the Bronco was him, and it certainly wasn't her husband. He immediately ran out to the barn and then came back, grabbed the phone, and called the state police. Someone had been driving their vehicle, he said. They had no idea who, and no one was in the vehicle when he checked on it, but the engine was warm. The state police came out, and the whole story was told more than once, and the family who owned the vineyard was flabbergasted. At first, I thought that the state trooper thought it was the man messing with us, but it became apparent very quickly that he had all of his time accounted for at the vineyard during the times I had seen the truck driving around. They had no idea that the truck had been leaving the barn. Tire tracks from the back of the barn were followed, and they went out a very old path that was rarely used by the vineyard folks that did get access back to the main road. Someone was going into their barn unbeknownst to them and driving their Bronco up and down the back roads, and obviously up to my family's cabin. After we told them what had been going on, the state trooper said they were going to be having to send out an investigative team and took all of our names and phone numbers and said they'd be in contact if they needed more information. He said there was nothing more that we could do at that point, and we were free to go. He did say that he was glad that we were all safe. The people at the vineyards were so shocked they gave us a case of wine and were sorry to hear that their vehicle had been causing us trouble. To this day, no one has ever found out who was driving that Bronco around. The state police never came up with any solid information, and the people who owned the vineyard put new locks on the barn where it was stored. The guy also went so far as to put giant steel bars between the doors, both in the front and back, so that they could only be removed with a different lock. Suffice it to say, we all went home pretty creeped out. I've been back up to the cabin dozens of times since this all happened, and I've been back to that vineyard. I've actually looked at the Bronco, but it has never left the property again, and I never see it driving around. As far as I know, the owners were actually going to sell it last year. If I go up this summer, I'll check. To whoever was in that Bronco stalking me and my friends, don't bother coming around anymore. The next time, I'm not going to hesitate to shoot. Abandoned Church, submitted by Paul. When I was a kid, I lived in rural Missouri. My friends and I would find ourselves walking down the train tracks that ran through our town. Truly dangerous, but when trains would come by, we would at least get off the tracks. We weren't that dumb. About a mile outside the town we lived in, there was this old church that was used when I was little, but for whatever reason fell into decay and was abandoned. One boring fall weekend, we decided to walk down the tracks and go check out the church. It was a late afternoon, and I remember that incredibly well as what we saw when we got there. All the stained glass windows were gone, and I'm assuming someone took them out because they weren't broken, they just weren't there. That's actually how we got into the church, as the front door still had big chains on them and was locked. The three of us climbed into the church, and it was really eerie. All of the pews were still there, all the hymnals and prayer books were still there, but it had this really funky odor like rotten wood. Obviously, the rain and dampness did a number on everything. As we were looking around, I walked up to the altar and saw that the baptismal bath thing was still there, as was the original woodwork and dais. There was some kind of dark, inky liquid in the baptismal thing, but I figured it was just mold. I went up onto the altar, and that's when my friend Jeff pointed over my head and said, "Oh wow, look at that." I turned around, and the crucifix that was on the wall behind me was upside down and had been painted black. We all kind of stopped what we were doing and looked at it, knowing that something was very wrong here. There was a book on the dais, and I opened it. It had a bunch of symbols and words that I couldn't read, but it just added to the whole eeriness of the church. I actually thought about taking it, but Jeff said, "Don't do that." In typical fashion, it got really dark as a storm was coming. We could hear the thunder in the distance and knew we probably should get going. I don't know why, but we all got a feeling that at that point in time we were not supposed to be there. Something was going on that just gave us that vibe that we should leave. I got down off the altar, and we were slowly making our way back to the window we'd come through, when a door opened behind us. We turned around to see two people in dark robes, kind of like Klan outfits, but black. They had hoods on with the eyes cut out. One of them pointed at us and shouted, "You are not welcome here. Do not come back." Then they started moving towards us. Of course, we scrambled out of that window as fast as we could and started running pell-mell down the train tracks back to town. We stopped once to look back, and in the distance saw the two figures in the robes standing at the edge of the train tracks, but they didn't come any further. We got home right before the rain, and I told my dad what we had seen. At first he just sat in his chair looking at us. and then in true 1970s dad fashion, didn't give a rat's ass about what we were talking about. He just yelled at us about going out there and how dangerous it was, and how if he found out we did it again, we were all dead. I never brought it up again, but my friends and I still talk about it on Facebook or whenever there's some sort of get-together that we see one another. I never jumped to the conclusion that there were Satanists or something out there, but those guys were obviously out there for some nefarious reason, and it had nothing to do with church as we knew it growing up. The church is long gone. I think someone set a light to it and it burned to the ground back in the early 90s. But I'll never forget being that scared when those guys came out from behind the altar.
Disturbing Discovery, submitted by It's Chris, Not Chris. I just discovered your channel, and I wanted to share a story from the 80s if I could. My two friends Ronnie and Bill loved to get into trouble. We were always sneaking into places we shouldn't have been. There was a junkyard at the edge of our town that we would always go exploring in and get chased out of by the owners, and any place that we could go that was out of bounds was the first places that we wanted to go. I suppose you could say that we were urban explorers, but out in the suburbs. Suburban explorers? Fine, I'll use that label. Bill's uncle had a piece of property way out in the sticks, and we decided to go out there and do what young guys do, get into trouble. We had some fireworks and thought we would go shoot them off where we were in an area that no one would complain about it. Speaking of junkyards, there was another piece of property that came up to his uncle's place where the guy who owned it had a whole bunch of old rusted-out junk cars and trucks. It's funny, when I watch shows like American Pickers or whatever, I see the same sort of thing. Just tons of garbage, tons of junk, and a nice piece of land that I'm sure someone could have built a home on or used for any other type of recreational activity. So there we were on a hot summer day fooling around just being teenage boys. We were going to wait until dusk to shoot the fireworks off and had brought sandwiches and Pepsis for dinner. We ate and then Bill said, "Hey, let's go exploring." And we wandered over through the small group of trees to the property where all the junk cars and trucks were. All you could hear were the regular sounds of a field in the summer, cicadas, crickets, birds, just the usual things. We poked around at the edge of the property to see if anyone was over there, but determined that no one was, because we could see a large chain across the gravel road from the main road that brought you to this vehicle graveyard. All three of us were poking around, just looking into the windows of the cars, pushing down the urge to smash the windshields and wreck things, as some young men will often be inclined to do. Honestly, there were some really neat old cars that were just rusted out beyond repair, but it was fun poking and prodding around, just looking at all the things that were there. I was looking at what I think was a Studebaker, and for whatever reason decided to see if I could look in the trunk. It was sort of sagging open, and I had to kind of pry it up with my hands. What I saw inside is what terrifies me to this day. There was a bunch of children's clothing in the trunk, and I mean little kid clothes for like 5 or 8-year-olds. There was blood on a lot of them. That I was sure of. I know the difference between what blood that's dried looks like from rust. And it doesn't even matter. The fact that there was a whole bunch of little kids' underwear and clothing in this car in the middle of nowhere is scary. I yelled to my friends and they came over and looked in. All three of us were just looking at the stuff wide-eyed, and I said we should get the heck out of there and call the cops. They both agreed. Without shutting the trunk, we started to back up when we heard the sound of tires on gravel. I did my best to shut the trunk, and we turned around to see a truck coming up the road from the main road, and we knew it had to be the guy who owned the property, or at least someone who had access to taking down the heavy chain that blocked the road. We dove into the trees where we had to go through to get back to Bill's uncle's property. But Bill, however, stopped and turned around and said, "Let's see what happens." We kind of crouched down and watched a fairly new pickup drive up to where we had just been. 2 guys got out, and I whispered to Bill, "Is this the guy that owns the place?" He shook his head and whispered back, "Oh, the guy who owns this place is really old. I have no idea who these guys are." Bill had been going out there with his uncle for a long time, and certainly would have recognized someone had he seen them before. So we all sat there in silence as one of the guys yelled out, "What the fuck?" He walked over to the car trunk that we had just been standing at moments before, and yelled out to the other guy, "We need to get rid of this stuff.
As we looked at them, they looked like regular normal guys that we saw in our neighborhood, and quite frankly in our families. They both had on khaki pants and nice shirts, and they didn't look scraggly like you hear on all the other stories on YouTube. They honestly looked like two businessmen who stopped to look around. The other guy went back to the truck and got a big black garbage bag between the two of them. They threw all of the clothes that we had just looked at, and then started looking around the property. We thought for a lot of tense moments that they were going to either see us or hear us, but they didn't. After a little while, they got back into the truck and then sat there, probably because the air conditioning was on and it was hot as heck out that day. I motioned to my friends that we should slowly back up and then get back to Bill's uncle's property, and that's what we did. We got there and were debating about running to the police and letting them know what we had just seen, but we were also worried about being called trespassers and getting in trouble for being on someone else's property. That's when we heard tires on gravel again. We looked up, and coming up the little road to Bill's uncle's property where we were hanging out was the same red truck. The guys got out and said, "Hi boys, how's it going?" None of us said anything for a few seconds, and finally Bill said, "We're doing okay, who are you?" One guy just laughed and said that they'd seen our car and thought that he would stop by and say hello. We said we were just waiting to shoot off some fireworks, and they said, "Well, have fun and be safe." They got back in the truck, backed up, turned around, and then drove back down the gravel road. That's when I noticed there were no license plates on the front or back of the truck. We waited there until we couldn't hear the truck anymore and decided that now it was time to leave. We got back on the road after putting up Bill's uncle's chain across the road, and then made for the closest sheriff's outpost. We were really kind of scared, and could not stop shaking and talking about what the heck was going on. I mean, who were those guys? Why were they out there? Why would they take those clothes out of that trunk? I mean, we just had nothing but questions. When we got to the sheriff's outpost, thankfully one was in, and we told him what we had seen, and he just shook his head. He got on the phone and made a call, then made another call, then called Bill's uncle. He was asking questions about who might have been out there, and then said he was going to go out and look for himself. At this point, I don't think he really believed our story. He told us to stay where we were and drove back to the property and was back in about 45 minutes. He said there was nothing out there, and the trunk of the car we had described had been shut. He also pried it up with his hands and looked inside, but there was nothing there. Here's the kicker. The man who owned that property had been dead for 3 years. My Uncle Bill confirmed that. The land was still in his name, but had not been distributed to a family member. It was just kind of out there on its own. He didn't have any sons or any relatives that lived anywhere remotely near where we lived, and no one as far as the sheriff knew had access to the property. How those guys got there was beyond me. We went home and went to Bill's house. Bill's uncle was on the porch talking to Bill's dad, and we told him everything that we had seen all over again, and he kept shaking his head wondering who those guys were. He asked us if we were being on the up and up about seeing things that we had seen, and we assured him that we were not making any of it up. The next day, Bill's uncle went back to the property and walked over to the guy's place next door. It was clearly apparent that someone had either cut the original cable or lock and replaced it or both with something new. Bill's uncle was positive that the old lock had been tarnished with age and rain and the elements. This was a shiny new lock and a fairly new chain across the gravel road. He followed that up with the police, but that was the last we heard of anything. Of course, we had given the sheriff a full description of the truck and the guys, but again, I don't think anyone was taking it seriously other than Bill's uncle and father. We were told that week that the property was off limits to us unless there were adults around. I mean, we were teenagers and could handle ourselves, but that decision was made and that was it. Some nights, I'll be out in my backyard having a campfire, or even inside watching my grandkids playing in my living room. And my mind will drift back to think about who those two guys were, why those little kids' clothes were bloody and stuffed into the trunk of an old car. Those are the nights I usually have nightmares.
The Men in the Woods by Eagle River D. I was in Juneau, Alaska once traveling on business. After work, I decided to drive north out of town and I was stopping randomly at different beaches. I stopped at this one and was having a great time on the beach by myself, just watching the birds fishing and looking at the tidal pools. A truck pulled up in the parking lot above me, and I didn't think much of it. The first time. The truck spun around and left, heading north. I wandered further down the beach, and a few minutes later, the truck came back. It parked at the overlook for a bit, and this beach was probably 50 feet lower in elevation than the parking lot. There was just a bluff, and it just sat there on the bluff. Then it peeled out again and headed off towards the south. I was a bit creeped out, and about this time I started making my way back to the trail to go back to my car. Right about then, the truck came back. It parked with its headlights shining right towards me and just sat there. It was now getting to be dusk. Then it peeled out, but I heard it stop right where my car was parked. I heard the engine shut down on the truck, and right then every instinct in me said, hide. I left the beach and went straight into the woods and somewhat up a little hill. Juneau has big trees, and I found one that had been knocked down, and I laid down on the far side of it. I was wearing a bright blue jacket and knew even in the fading light I stuck out like a sore thumb. My cell phone had a poor connection, and I wasn't armed because I can't carry any weapons when I travel by airplane. I was scared spitless at this point. Then I heard slam, slam, and I knew that there were at least 2 people out there. They had waited a while, I guess, maybe to see if I was coming up the trail. And now they started down it, and one of the men appeared to have a long object, and I think it was a rifle, but in the fading light it may have been a bat or something else. He was calling out, "Hello? Where are you?" All of a sudden, I felt very much like I'd just stepped into the most dangerous game. I remained hidden, heart beating wildly. I waited until the men were well down onto the beach, and then began climbing the hill in the woods up to where I knew the parking lot was. I tried not to make any noise, but of course that was impossible. There were dried leaves and deadfalls all over the place. I was making a heck of a racket. But I guess they never heard me. I got up to my car, and the truck freaked me out. It was fully tinted, and there was no way to tell if anyone was still inside the vehicle. I started my car and tore out of there. I have hiked alone all my life and been in far more remote places than this, but never before or since have I had such a feeling that I was in grave danger. To this day, I don't feel I overreacted. I am sure that those men had something very bad in store for me had they caught me. Out in Idaho. I imagine one could make up a Bigfoot story if they wanted to, but I doubt one could make up the scenario that led to this encounter. During the early 90s, I wanted to live like Grizzly Adams, and I moved to a remote wilderness in northern Idaho. To give an idea of how remote an area this was, the Forest Service road just past our place was gated off to protect grizzly bears. Only a handful of people lived in this area, spread out over a dozen 24-acre properties. Everything else was just extreme wilderness. This was north of Sandpoint, Idaho. The night of my encounter, meeting Bigfoot was the last thing on my mind, and I must say I was confused by what I saw as well as being left utterly speechless. Although I had grown up in Northern California and was familiar with Bigfoot lore, I pretty much filed it away as a neat story, but not something to believe in. When you're broke and living on a mountain, there's not much to do except get together with neighbors and have a good time. Our lot was no different. I must add that during this time of my life, drinking was not big on my list, and this evening was no different. However, it was Halloween, and I had had some beer earlier in the evening, between 5 and 8 or so. Please remember, I was weighing in at 240 pounds, and the actual sighting was well into the night, probably between 11 and 1 a.m. So anyway, my ex and I were at this Halloween party, and had slipped into our normal silent argument routine. So, needless to say, we weren't talking. One of the neighbors had arrived with a tractor pulling a trailer loaded with straw in hopes of taking everyone on a hayride. Eventually, we left on it, and there were around 16 of us, evenly made up of adults and children of all ages, costumes and all. Upon leaving, I don't think we had a destination in mind, but someone eventually suggested we head to Bloom Lake, a small mountain lake with rough access that would require leaving the tractor at the logging road and then walking the remaining half-mile or so. As stated earlier, my ex and I were giving each other the silent treatment and found ourselves drifting to the back of the 2x2 line. Eventually, we'd allowed enough space to develop between us and the pack to lose sight of them as they went around bends in the trail. As we neared the lake, the trail forked in two directions, both leading to it. My ex and I were just close enough to see the backside of the last person headed down the trail to the right. As we came to the fork, I was closest to the center fork, while my ex was outside on the far right. Right as we approached the intersection, I focused on a being crouched down at the base of a tree where the trails came together. This animal stayed put while I tried to figure out what I was seeing. It felt like total slow motion. I had a visual on it, and I was staring right at it. However, the animal did not seem to be interested in eye contact. Just as we passed by and the animal was to my left behind me, I looked over my shoulder to see it rise silently next to the tree it had been crouching next to. I'm 6'3", and I would guess this being to be about 8 feet tall. Standing now, this animal did not want eye contact still, and kept us in its peripheral vision. I looked forward and could see the back of the last person ahead of us, and I wanted to yell out to everyone, but figured it was not the best thing to do. I doubt that I was close enough to touch it, but I am quite sure it could have reached me without taking a step. I thought that I should say something to the ex, but I was speechless. I looked over my shoulder again to see this animal take a huge, silent step out of the brush, and then take only 2 or 3 more up the trail we had come down before being out of sight. These steps were large, silent, and punctuated with his long arms swinging with his strides. I spent many years wondering how no one else saw this, and I never told anyone from that night, except the ex. I was familiar with forest wildlife and had viewed several species at length before this. I've always consoled myself by saying, I'm not sure what I saw, but I know what I didn't see, and it wasn't a bear, elk, a mountain lion, moose, or anything else I can think of. Even after my encounter, I still thought most of the TV shows out there were jokes, but now I think differently. This area of Bonner County, Idaho, is very close to the encounter told of in the Pack River area. It's also close to the Clark Fork area encounters, kind of between the two. I always wondered what Bigfoot thought about 16 people coming down the trail at this time of night, costumes and all. I mean, this area is remote. 16 people at any time must have been a shock. I lived in that area for around 6 years, and in that time I viewed large footprints in the snow, mud, and soft shoulder soil. I'd often visited another lake nearby, and one time, upon reaching the top of the trail, found a large scat pile and could smell the rankest odor. I felt like I was not alone and headed home immediately. And from time to time I would hear shrieks in the forest around my cabin, but never could figure out what it was. At this time I was usually very angry, dealing with my ex, and these things would just get filed away as something to worry about later. I had actually forgotten most of these until now. Ghost Cabin in the Woods by David S. This ghost experience which I am writing about took place many years ago when I was much younger. Somewhere around 11 years old. Obviously I'm now older, but I have some memories which will never leave me. Most of them took place when I lived with my grandparents in a fairly small town in the country. We lived in an area surrounded by woods in an old but comfortable house. During these years I was used to taking walks in the woods, and I was very interested in nature, could sit for hours by the lake staring up at the sky and the towering trees. I grew very familiar with the woods and walked the same trails each day, knowing where each direction led. However, one particular day, while walking in my usual path, I became lost while walking back home. I couldn't recognize the surrounding trees, and I knew I had never walked in this area before. Puzzled, I thought that I had taken a wrong step somewhere. Daydreaming, I must have lost track of time and stumbled upon an old undiscovered path. As I tried to find my way, it became dark, and the area grew less and less familiar. Soon I became scared and quickened my pace, and not minutes had passed until I came upon an old cabin. This cabin was withered and seemed to blend in with the surrounding area. I felt a distinct chill as I walked closer, and my fear only increased. In the dark, I called out to see if anyone was home and got no response. Walking into the house, my footsteps creaked, and I brushed away cobwebs from around me. I walked into a small room which had a bed, and it seemed as if no one had slept there for years. I decided to stay in this room where I could sleep until the morning, so I closed the door, knowing that this would not make me feel any safer. The distinct feeling of someone watching was felt everywhere in this little house, but it grew even stronger in the bedroom. I closed my eyes and drifted into a light sleep. When I heard the sound of a door slamming, I could also feel a presence walking through the house. I tried to call out to see who it was, but was too scared to make a sound. When the sound stopped, I could feel a ghostly presence standing before the door of the bedroom, and suddenly the hair on the back of my neck stood up as I decided to try and escape. When the door opened, I could not breathe as I witnessed a tall figure which uttered a horrible-sounding laughter. This lasted only a minute, and the being then vanished into the wall, and I went to the door in order to leave this stupid house. As I ran to the front door, I could feel this presence moving towards me, making a very rapid, low breathing sound. Before I could catch my breath, I blacked out, collapsing to the floor. As I awoke, I found myself in the woods in a familiar area. I could remember only until the moment where I had gone unconscious, and I felt as frightened as I had at that moment. Looking in each direction, I did not see any trace of the cabin or any change in the surroundings. I was in the place I had been walking through on my way home, and I realized that not even an hour had passed. As I arrived home, I was greeted by my grandparents, which I had feared would be looking for me. And when I told them about this strange walk I had taken, and about the old cabin, they looked at each other with a glance and then fell silent. They then told me I had been dreaming, and that I hadn't been gone for more than a few hours. They're no longer with us, but they never spoke about it after that day, and I always thought they might have been keeping something from me. Was it a ghost that I had seen? Is it even possible for an entire cabin to appear, as if it were a ghost? Firepower Saved the Day by Bon Scott 420. This story took place back in the late 1990s. My brother and some friends used to go camping and fishing and shooting at a piece of land owned by a friend's family. It was out in the middle of nowhere and butted up against some state preserves, with the only little town about 5 miles away. To get to where we would camp, you left a 2-lane country route, took a paved road that eventually turned into a dirt road, and then turned into an even more dirt road, if that makes sense. There were a few hunting cabins here and there, and even a couple of permanent residents way out, but for the most part it was just sprawling fields and forest. This time we went out there, it was my brother, who I'll call R, our friend T, and another friend G. We had stocked up on food and drinks and were planning on staying there for a long weekend, Thursday to Sunday in late August. We arrived and set up our campsite in a little clearing in some woods far away from the dirt road that led us there. Where we were, if you were driving by to the preserve or just passing through, you'd never even knew we were out there. This was always a great time of guys just being guys, staying up late around a campfire, getting up and fishing and swimming, target and pigeon shooting, and hiking around the area to explore what was out there. All right, before the nuts come out of the woodwork, I'm talking about clay target pigeons, not real ones. We had brought along quite an arsenal, and usually did, as this was the one time every year we got together and wanted to show one another anything new we had purchased or otherwise obtained. One year G brought an old musket, and other years someone had brought a new handgun for everyone to try. And of course there was always the new fishing tackle that would really catch the fish. Yeah, right. This time out I had brought my AKM, my brother had his Colt AR-15, T had brought a Ruger of which I can't remember what model, and there were other shotguns and pistols for everyone to shoot. I only mention the rifles specifically as they play a part in this story. And now, before everyone brings out the anti-gun stuff, let me just say that none of us have these weapons anymore, and that I totally understand why people don't want others having access to them. I came to realize that I only shot mine on occasions like this, and my money was better invested in my collection of competition shotguns. The tragedies happening in our country and around the world right now are horrific, and while I am NRA, I may be the only one who thinks there should be stiffer regulations for owning these weapons. Anyway, back to the story. So there we were, having fun in the sun, and after shooting at some paper targets, We took a swim in the pond and then started to think about dinner as it was in the afternoon. I volunteered to cook and got to work setting up the fire to make some steak and potatoes, and the other guys went off to hike around the land and check out some spots we rarely went to. So, alone, I cracked a beer and waited to get a decent bed of coals going. I was sitting in a chair reading a Stephen King book when I got that creepy feeling someone was watching me. I looked around and saw nothing and went back to reading. But that feeling came again, and then I heard a twig snap behind me, and just as I was unholstering my Smith & Wesson 9mm, I turned around and heard a voice call out. It was just Pete, a guy who lived out here not too far from our campsite. I sighed a sigh of relief and stood up to greet him and offered him a beer. Pete was a little weird, but a good enough guy. He just liked living far away from everything after his wife passed away a few years earlier. He had heard a shooting and wanted to come over and say hi. After a bit, we heard the guys coming back, and there was a lively discussion with Pete about what had been going on out here and so on. We invited Pete to stay for dinner and into the night as we kept talking and putting back the beers. Around midnight, we decided to turn in and head for our tents, and sleep was easy, but I woke up to more twigs breaking softly and soft footsteps. And then there was the snuffling, and I whispered to T, whose tent was right next to mine. Hey, hear that? Yep, just coyotes checking us out. Don't sweat it, he said. This was usual for out here, but beyond that I heard something else I didn't mention. Heavier footsteps, and I swear whispering, and maybe a whistle? I knew there was a whistle, and I knew it wasn't any bird or animal, but I just rolled over to feel my shotgun just in case. Eventually the sounds died down and I went back to sleep. The next morning I got up to find my brother messing with the Coleman propane stove, and I mentioned the sounds to him. He hadn't heard anything, and he decided to run back into the little town to get a couple more propane canisters, as we used one in the lantern the night before, and another one we brought was empty. He took off, and G&T got up, and we went to take a swim and a shower at a pond. I went when they got back, and my brother finally showed up and made breakfast. It was another fun day of just being outside, and G surprised us with his gift to the trip, a box of tracer rounds. I had never shot them, and thought that would be cool to do right at dusk before it would be illegal to shoot in the dark. Fast forward to that evening, and while we were getting another fire stoked for a round of grilled chicken, we shot a few of those rounds of tracers at some targets, and it was pretty cool to see the colored lines from the shots zoom through the dusk. More beer flowed that night, and just as the fire was dying down, we heard more twigs snapping off in the woods near us. Now, we weren't paranoid, but we were familiar with the sounds out here, and we knew this wasn't deer, and we could hear the coyotes yipping far away as they made their rounds. G spoke up and said, "Did you guys hear a whistle?" None of us had, and we shook our heads. But then we did hear another one. And then another. They were all coming from different spaces around us, mostly behind us, coming from the direction of the pond. We were all dead silent as we heard more movement, and then a voice fairly distant call out, "Yoo-hoo, boys! Can we come over to play?" My brother looked at me dead in the eyes, and then at G and T. There was laughter and more sounds of movement. Then 3 more whistles. There were 3 people out there moving towards us, signaling one another with the whistling as to where they were. T pointed in 3 different directions as to where he thought they were standing or moving, and my brother nodded. Whistles came again, and another voice said, "It's awfully quiet over there. What's the matter, boys?" And then a freaky laugh rang out. T spoke up. "You're on private property and you're not welcome here. Leave." Silence. Then more movement. "That's not very hospitable of you boys," said a voice. "We're all nice guys, ain't that right?" More laughter. They were getting closer, but were still out of the light of our lantern and fire. My brother pointed at our rifle bags and then at our targets that were off to the left of where these people were coming from. I knew what he meant, and so did T. G spoke up. "Seriously, this isn't cool. You're trespassing. Turn around and leave now." More silence. "How about a beer before you hand over your shit?" said the voice. Now the sounds of steps were much closer. And by this time we had all armed ourselves with our rifles, and I should point out that all of them had 30-round magazines loaded. My brother pointed at our targets once again and whispered, "Shoot below them into the ground and go full pack. That'll scare them off." We were already a little spread out and raised our rifles quietly, and my brother counted down from 3, and we let the lead fly. 120 rounds just blasting away at tree stumps and the ground. I had forgotten I had left tracer rounds in my magazine, and that made the firepower all that more dramatic. It sounded like a war zone, and for nearly 20 seconds or so the deafening sound of semi-automatic fire filled the night. We never got the chance to hear whoever it was running away, but when the echoes died down, all was silent in the woods. We all remained quiet with the buzzing in our ears, and we didn't have time to put on our ear protection. I fished some beers out of the cooler, and after a bit we heard someone coming from the direction of our vehicles. It was Pete, wondering what the fuck was going on. T told them what had happened and why we had done what we did. He shook his head and wondered aloud who was out there, and whoever it was, they were not up to continuing to fuck with us that night, I can guarantee you. We all stayed up around the fire, eating and drinking more beer, listening for a return of whoever was out there, but they were long gone. When first light came, we fanned out into the forest in the direction of where we heard the voices and searched around us for clues as to who it was. G found a very large Bowie knife that he actually kept and still has, and my brother found the coup de grace, a pair of soiled pants. Someone, in their haste to run away, had shit their drawers last night. We all voted on staying the rest of the weekend, and I went into town to the little store to get some more beer and water. While I was in there, the shopkeeper Ray, who we'd known for years, asked if our friends had found us. "What friends?" I asked. "Oh, the 4 guys that came in the other day asking where you were camping. Said they missed your meetup back in town and couldn't remember where you were staying. The 4 guys with the long hair." I looked at Ray and said, "Those weren't our friends, Ray." I then asked him if he had told them where we were. He put his head down and nodded. Said, "Yeah, I'm sorry." His face was white, and he kept apologizing, but I told him to forget it. When I got back to the camp, I relayed the info to the guys, and everyone just shook their heads. The rest of the weekend was quiet, and we had a good time, but we kept going over and over what had happened and wondering who those guys were, how they knew we were out there, and what they were up to. Our group doesn't really get together that much anymore. Life got in the way, and families took priority over hangouts in the woods. My brother and I still shoot competitively, and I do see him more often than anybody else. I heard Pete passed away last summer, and I've only been out to our camping spot a couple of times since that last trip. What we did was dangerous that night, but I am convinced that was the best way to scare off someone who clearly had bad intentions. I had been tracked by Eye of the Taiga. When I was a kid in Colorado, I spent a lot of time cross-country skiing in the mountains, often alone. One beautiful winter afternoon, I drove to a trailhead of a favorite place and began skiing up the old mining road, which wound and rolled its way gently uphill into a remote wilderness area. At that elevation, the forest was a mixture of Douglas firs, lodgepole, and alpine firs, which transitioned to alpine firs, bristlecone pines, then open alpine tundra at the higher elevations towards which I was headed. The first several miles of the trail were fairly well forested, and sight distance on both sides of the trail was limited. I was setting fresh tracks in about 4 inches of new snow, and there was no sign of another human for many miles. After skiing less than a mile, I began to get the creepy feeling that I was being watched. I started looking around as I skied, and looking over my shoulders constantly. I occasionally stopped abruptly and looked back, but I never saw anything but sparkling snow and pristine forest. I continued to ski, but couldn't shake that creepy feeling that I was not alone and was still being watched. After a couple of miles more, I couldn't take it anymore. I executed a 180-degree kick turn and headed back in my tracks. I had not gone more than 40 feet when I came to big cat tracks in my ski tracks. The cat had seconds before diverted into the trees just to my left. I set a new record time for the return trip to the car. and although I continued to check over my shoulder occasionally, I never saw anything. The cat had picked me up about 30 yards from the car and had been right on my tail for 3 miles. Not Alone in the Woods, submitted by Hunter Snowman. I've been hunting for a long time, since I was a kid with my father, my uncles, and my friends. Going to Uncle Roy's cabin was a big deal when I was in my teens. It meant a guy's weekend, sometimes skipping school for an opener. Good food and maybe a beer or two, as my dad believed in letting me experience things early so I would make better choices later on in life. Uncle Roy's cabin was up in northern Wisconsin, and it was a great place with 2 rooms of bunks and a huge great room with a kitchen, fireplace, comfy old chairs. It was a home away from home for sure. It stayed in our family after Uncle Roy died back in 1998, and we still use it. But there was one trip with my cousin and best friend that almost made up our minds to never go back. It was early fall, and we went up for a weekend to try our luck on the 60-plus acres, and the drive was about an hour from Appleton, where we lived. We were all a couple of years out of college, and it was Travis, me, and my cousin George. We left mid-afternoon and got there before 5, and it was already dark. We got our gear inside and turned on the propane, got a fire going, and figured we'd just kick back with a couple of beers, have some chili, and then hit the sack early before we went out in the morning. It was gun season for deer, and we were all hoping to bag at least one. The next morning was crisp, and we ate some oatmeal, took some power bars, and then suited up and started the walks out to the tree stands out on the property. I think a lot of people have a notion that hunting is the most exciting thing in the world, and it can be thrilling, but a lot of the time it's just sitting on your ass waiting. I had brought a portable radio with headphones that I was playing softly, and for some reason it was Coast to Coast with Art Bell. If you don't know what that show is, it's a talk show that talks about ghosts and Bigfoot and stuff like that. It was about 6 a.m. and it was the only thing I could get in reception, so it kind of gave a spooky air to the whole weekend, that's for sure. Anyway, things were pretty quiet for a couple of hours, and the sun was now up higher in the sky, and I was going to give it a couple of more and then take a break and maybe come back out later. After about a half hour, the show had some guy on talking about demons and stuff, and it was really freaking me out. I only had one earpiece in so I could monitor what was going on around me, and then I heard the sound of leaves crunching. I slowly turned a bit to scan around the area and see if I was about to have a little honey coming my way. But I saw it was Travis holding his shotgun in the crook of his arm, and his other hand looked bloody. I got down from my stand and asked him what was up. He had a weird tale. Travis had heard a noise behind him, like something crashing through the brush, and then he heard something like a muffled yell. Thinking it was someone hurt, and maybe one of us, he got down and went in the direction of where he heard the sounds. Seeing some branches swaying back and forth, he called out and walked towards a part of the forest edge that was stacked with trees. He got to the edge, called out again, and then popped down a little path that led deeper into the forest. As he walked between 2 trees, a thick branch came whipping towards him and cracked him square on the hand, and he dropped his shotgun. He said he heard a laugh and steps running away through the forest before he got over the shock and saw his hand was really banged up. I took a peek at it, and it was really swollen. He could move it, so we didn't think it was broken, but he certainly needed to get some ice on it pronto. We tried to get a message to George, but our signal out here was weak on our cell phones, so I figured he'd just head back to the cabin on his own, and we started walking back to it. When we got there, I got some ice, and Travis put it in a towel and wrapped his hand, and we kept talking about what had happened. He kept saying it was like some crank had set him up, and it wasn't normal to have a booby trap out in the middle of nowhere on posted land like that. It was about another hour when we heard footsteps coming towards the cabin on the gravel, and in came Georgie with a rapidly bruising eye and scratches on his forehead. We immediately asked what the heck had happened to him, and he said something similar to what Travis had said. He'd heard a strange sound in the woods, and when he went to check it out, his foot snagged on something, and the next thing he knew, a thick branch swung down onto the trail and caught him in the temple and face. He wasn't bleeding badly, but I got him some ice too. I said out loud that we should talk to the authorities, as it seemed like someone who was not supposed to be out there was making little traps for us to come across. I volunteered to go the next morning, and I said we should lay low for the rest of the night. At about 2 in the morning, we started to hear thumping on the roof, and soon figured out someone was throwing rocks at the cabin. Nothing at the windows, just up on the roof. Everyone was awake at this point, and I told Travis to get his shotgun and go to the back door. I would go to the front door, and on the count of 3, we would open the doors and fire off 2 shells into the air to scare away anyone who was out there. We got ready, and on 3, blam, 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 4 shots almost in perfect unison. Then everything was quiet. We stayed up a bit longer, but nothing happened, so we finally fell back to sleep. I got up early and made the journey to the nearest town where there was a substation and told the deputy everything that had been going on. He said he had a little time to follow me out to our place and have a look around with us. When we made our way up the driveway to the cabin, I noticed that on the outside wall someone had written the words, "Go away," in charcoal. The deputy asked if I knew what that was about, and I hadn't even noticed it before. I brought him inside, introduced George and Travis, and we all had a cup of coffee before we set out for our stands and some of the trails we frequently went down while we were hunting. It was an interesting and terrifying walk, as not only the deputy, but all 3 of us found some pretty creepy things out there. On one thin path between trees and a drop-off of about 15 feet down to a creek, the deputy noticed that someone had set up another trip line close to the ground that could have resulted in a dangerous fall for someone. Near the tree stand George was in, there was something really disturbing. This stand didn't have a ladder, and you used foot pegs and a belt to get up into it. It stayed there all year long. Usually, anyone who was using this stand would just jump down as it was only about 8 or 10 feet up. Good thing George hadn't, because someone had dug a pit about 3 feet deep and put sharpened sticks at the bottom of it, covered it up with light branches and a thin layer of sod. You could stand on it, but a jump down would have surely meant impalement. The deputy was taking pictures of everything and also taking notes in his little pad. There were more booby traps all around the land, at least the portion we frequented. The craziest one? Near a stand my dad used a lot. At the base, there were a number of small holes. And the holes pointed upward were shotgun shells, slugs. On each shell was glued a BB on the primer, and there was a flat stone underneath each one. In essence, if someone stepped on one hard enough or jumped down from the stand, yeah, think about that. Boom. We went back to the cabin, and the deputy radioed for more help, and for the rest of the weekend, there were stadies and deputies going all over the land to see what else might be out there. They finally came across a tent in a growth of trees. Inside was a mishmash of dirty clothes, empty food cans and wrappers, a handwritten notebook about how to make traps and bombs, as well as some glass jars that the deputy later proved to be improvised bombs that had to be destroyed by a bomb expert. There were also a bunch of handmade signs that said things like, "Meat is murder," and "How do you like being hunted?" and "Get out or else." Some of these were hanging from trees in our places on the land, and we had not noticed them. They never found anyone, and this is the only time something like this happened out there. The deputies thought it must have been an earth lover that got a little misguided. Yeah, I guess that's one way to put it. We've been back lots of times, and we've all gotten our share of deer and turkey and boar, but thankfully whoever was out there doing all that stuff to scare us off never came back. If that guy by chance hears this, dude, there are other ways to talk to us about your views that don't involve trying to kill us. I'm still shaking my head over that weekend. My Time in Dudleytown by Stacy. Last year, me and my boyfriend went to Dudleytown in mid-November. If you don't know what Dudleytown is, it's a settlement that was founded in the mid-1700s and was abandoned in the early 1800s in Connecticut. No one knows why it was abandoned. We entered through the dark entry road, which didn't have a street sign, but we were able to figure it out through directions, pictures, and a good hunch. We noticed the sign, but of course ignored it anyway. As soon as we left the car, our phones lost service, and we walked until we came across what looked like stone basements. I tried using my phone the entire walk, and sometimes it would ring 2 or 3 times, but then it would go into a strange static. I thought nothing of it, though. We were in the middle of the woods. The only thing that we saw that was scary was a white-tailed deer. Birds were chirping. It seemed like any other hike in the woods, and we couldn't leave well enough alone, though. We both took a rock from as close to the foundations as we would get. A little disappointed, we made our way back to the car with our rocks, and once we actually sat in the car, service returned to our phones. We drove away with our rocks in tow, and after leaving Cornwall Center, we witnessed what I thought was a funny but strange accident involving vehicles in front of us, which could have easily included myself had I not been paying attention. I dropped my friend off at his home, and he forgot his rock in my back seat. I put my rock on my front porch and then went in to watch some TV. I tried to turn down my volume via remote, but that wouldn't work. I pounded on the keys a few times, and suddenly the volume started lowering, but I wasn't touching the remote. It was strange because the volume decreased in single increments. 10, 9, 8, 7, down to mute. The problem with that is either manually or by remote, the volume only ever changed in increments of 2. I was freaked out enough that the next day I threw the rock on my porch in the woods and forgot about it. It was easy to forget, too, seeing as though my car was breaking down daily, weekly if I was lucky. I had other things on my mind. After clearing out my car and preparing it for yet another trip to the shop, I found my boyfriend's rock. I gave it back to my boyfriend and he put it under his bed, and later that night we were fooling around taking pictures, and almost all of them orbs could be seen, and unexplained smoke. One in particular, half of my face is covered in a haze. This is the point where I started to see a relation between odd things happening and these rocks that we took. Strange things seem to follow them, and I am by no means a superstitious person, and frankly don't believe the myths surrounding Dudleytown. Much of the reason why I took the rocks to maybe challenge whatever all the hype was about. We put the remaining rock in the car the next day with intentions to dispose of it. Again, it was forgotten for a few days, but remembered once my car started acting up again. We were leaving a friend's place when we finally decided to toss it and left it in the parking lot in a grassy area in front of her apartment. Less than 2 weeks later, her house was raided and she was in jail. Of course, had they been law-abiding citizens, a raid would have never taken place. It just seemed ironic that it happened so soon after we left that rock in front of it. They had been living there for over a year with no problems. And listen, I'm not saying that anything that happened in that month was paranormal, supernatural, or whatever else. What I am saying is that enough strange, uncanny things took place that I almost began to fear a rock. I noticed a distinct pattern between where they were placed and negative things that took place around them. My fears almost seemed too confirmed since discarding the rocks last year. I haven't had any problems since, no hazy photos, and no self-adjusting volume on my TV. Of course, there were smaller coincidences that are forgotten or not worth mentioning. But all in all, both of our families think we meddled with something we shouldn't have, and honestly, I do too. Sometimes there are just too many coincidences for it to be a coincidence. Village in the Middle of Nowhere. Submitted by Dark Razor Scratch. A few years back, I was really into off-roading in my D90 and took my rig all over the place in Pennsylvania, up into New England, over to West Virginia, and so on. I did a lot of the official parks like Roush Creek, Paragon before it closed, Chaos Park, and tons of great places, people, and times. A few friends and I usually all went together with our different vehicles, Jeeps, Dodges, and some homemade rigs too. Weekends were full of technical trails and climbs, breakdowns, and a whole shitload of fun. None of the guys I went with were into the whole mudding thing, and I'm not knocking that, but just blasting through mud holes wasn't really our thing. One weekend we had planned fell through, and I still wanted to go do something, so I talked to my buddy Ken to see if he'd be up for at least an afternoon of off-road fun, and he was down. We planned on hitting up Chaos, leave early in the morning, have some fun, and then be back late that night. I packed a bunch of sandwiches, soda, and chips into the cooler, hit up a local coffee shop for some Joe, and then picked up Ken. It was still super early in the AM, and we were having a great time just talking and drinking our coffee, planning out the day's events. So, we got to the park, hooked up with some other guys we'd met there before, and after a while of bullshitting and catching up, we spent the day playing in the woods and rocks and having a freaking blast. Late in the afternoon, we had a couple of beers and then stuck around talking shop. Before we knew it, it was dark and we needed to hit the road. One of the guys told me and Ken about a shortcut that should have gotten us home through this forest and saved us some time on the way home. Like total morons, we gave it a shot. Most of it was turn left at the stump you'll see on the right shit, and we scribbled that down on a piece of paper. So, off we went, looking for these weird landmarks, and after a while we're going down what basically were fire roads, when we got into what I thought was Virginia. The GPS was sketching out, and these directions were seriously shitty. Suddenly, we saw some lights up ahead, and we found ourselves driving into what looked like a settlement of some sort. There were trailers on cut lawns lining this fire road. Some had attached garages and carports, but all of them had lots of Confederate flags and such. Here and there, people were outside by fire pits, and with the windows down, the loudest sound was the crunching of my tires on the gravel. As we made our way through, people were coming out of their buildings and staring at us, and as we were getting to the end of this strip of trailers, about 7 big dudes stepped out onto the road blocking my D90. Ken looked at me and said, "What the fuck is this, man?" I told him to be cool as one of the guys started to walk over to my window. Ken looked back and hissed, "They're blocking the back too, man." I kept a smile on my face, and my hand left the gear shift and rested on my hip. That's where my holstered P-30L sat. I kept my other arm resting on the window and watched as the guy moved towards me. He was wearing a sleeveless flannel shirt with a jean vest, and he had long hair and a big beard. He got up to my door and peered inside. "Evening," I said. He just looked at me and nodded and sort of mumbled nothing. "Is everything okay? We're just trying to get back to a highway and get home." "Where'd you come from?" he asked. I could smell beer and cigarettes on his breath. I told him we had been at Chaos Park, and that we were following bad directions home with a laugh. "What do you mean it's bad out here?" he asked. Oh shit, I thought. We're going to do the dick dance. Ken coughed, and I looked over to see another guy standing by his door. I said I simply meant the directions were screwy, and I didn't think we were on the right road. "Pretty fancy truck you have here. Cost a lot?" I laughed a little and said, "Actually, I bought it used in Florida and fixed it up myself. It's a Land Rover Defender 90. "I can read, boy," he said flatly. Second time I thought, oh shit. I looked at Ken, then looked at the guys standing on the road, and I couldn't help but notice 2 of them had rifles in their arms. "Pretty expensive?" he asked again. I told him how much I paid for it, and that the labor was more than the basic cost of it. "How about you letting me take a little test drive?" I smiled a thin smile and said, "Afraid my insurance doesn't cover that, my friend." "I ain't your friend, he said. "Come on out of there, both of you." I looked at Ken, and then back at him. Then I looked at the guys in the road, and to this day, I can't believe what I did. Let me say this, I am not a fighting type of guy. I'm more of a quiet nerd than anything else, but I do hunt and shoot. I am an outdoors kind of guy, but I am the first guy to try to make peace with anybody in a bad situation. I stalled for a minute as he leaned right into the door and said, "Get out. Now." In a flash, I slammed my hand down on his arm that was now resting on the door window frame, and then ripped out the P-30 and pointed it at his face. I was literally shaking about what I was doing, and even now as I write this, the hair on my arms is raising up. His eyes got wide, and I said, "This ends right now. Start walking with me. Ken, shift." I didn't take my eyes off the guy, but could feel Ken staring at me when he said, "What?" "Shift the fucking truck, Ken," I said, and lightly stepped on the gas, let up on the clutch, and we slowly started rolling forward, slow enough for this guy to walk with his one arm stuck under mine, looking into the barrel of my pistol. He didn't say anything. He was just breathing hard and slowly walking along with me. "Ken, tell those motherfuckers to back off and keep their rifles pointed down." He said, "What? Oh, yeah. And then he yelled that out the window at them. They backed up and off the thin road. The dude was still staring at me and my pistol when I got to the edge of the clearing and slowed the D90. I let go of the guy's arm and said, "Sorry about that. We don't want any trouble." He just stared blankly and didn't say anything. I hit it and we lurched forward and took off into the darkness at a high rate of speed on that fire road. And that was it. No shots fired, no one racing after us, nothing like that. It felt like a dream as we plowed on until we came to a paved road, and I didn't even think to look at the directions or check my GPS. I just turned right and got the fuck out of there as fast as I could. Ken finally spoke up and said, "What the fuck do you think that was all about?" I shook my head, and he said we should probably tell somebody about that weird little colony, and I thought about it for a minute. "Brother, the local gendarmes are probably related to those guys or know all about them. Let's just get home." Turns out, overall, it wasn't a bad shortcut as we did get home pretty quickly, but I really wish the guys at the park had warned us about that place. The next day I looked on a map for what I thought was the closest town and called a state police barracks, but nobody answered the phone. I left a message about the strangeness of the night before, but I never heard back from anyone. We laugh about it now, but that night was the first and last time I ever pointed my P-30 at anyone, and I still can't believe I did that. I guess when push comes to shove, we're all capable of doing things we don't think we are. Scarface by You-Know-Who. When I was a kid, I went to this church camp about an hour and a half from my hometown. It was mostly kids from my church, but occasionally other kids from different places showed up too. It was a cool place, and outside of the Bible jazz we had to go through each day, there was a ton of stuff to do. There were crafts, sports, hiking, this really cool clay embankment you could make water slides out of and then slide into a creek, and every night we played stuff like Capture the Flag. You can check the place out. It's still open. It's called Camp Duffield. So, as I got older, I still went, but at that time I was a counselor in training, and later I was the athletic director. This story happened when I was a CIT, and it was counselors' night out. That meant the older counselors in the cabins either hung out in the food hall relaxing or playing cards or whatever, or they actually left camp for a meal at a nearby restaurant a few miles away. My counselor didn't want to leave our cabin, so my friend Tom, who was a CIT in another cabin, asked me to come over to his with his campers and tell them some stories. His counselor was going for the night out. I gladly did and thought I would tell the tale of Scarface. It had been told to just about every kid who ever went to that camp, and it was a sorry tale. As far as I know, there was a little truth to it, but of course, as time goes by, things got souped up for theatrical effect. Each cabin had about 10 sets of bunk beds on either side of one big room, and they each had a front and back door. It was the same for the guys and the girls, but they were separated by a larger building. The back door to the boys' cabins led almost directly down into a deep canyon with a creek at the bottom. So I went over to Tom's cabin, turned out the lights, grabbed a flashlight, and began the tale. The true part of the story is there was a guy who lived not too far from the camp that had been in a shop accident while he was working on a vehicle. He became terribly disfigured, sad but true. He still worked at the shop, but only at night, and no one really saw him during the day as his face was pretty mangled up and he was embarrassed about how he looked. He eventually turned to living in a shack out in the woods near the edge of the camp. Well, the loneliness and anger and rage took over, and the guy began stalking people at the camp at all hours of the day. Sometimes kids would be at the far edge of the camp at a lean-to called the Outpost, and they would see a figure in overalls with what looked like a mask just standing at the edge of the field watching over them. Other times, kids would be swimming in the pond and hanging out on a raft and look up to see the same guy crouched down at the edge of the water staring at them. He wasn't wearing a mask. That was his real face. Creepier encounters included kids being waylaid on their way back from the bathrooms in the dark of night to see a figure standing just outside the floodlights near the cabins. On more than one occasion, Scarface was seen up close by a camper as he peered in through the cabin windows and would sometimes try to open the locked doors as most of the campers slept, while others that were awake heard his footsteps and breathing. So I'm telling the campers all of these stories in the dark with just a little flashlight, and they were all riveted. Even the kids who had heard these stories or knew someone who had seen Scarface were getting scared. I picked up the story. See, after a while, old Scarface wasn't satisfied with just looking and scaring campers, I said. Soon his anger and sadness and frustration had built up so much that he resented the happiness of everyone, especially people at a Christian summer camp so close to his shack. All the campers were looking at me now. He grew bolder and bolder and would actually walk into the shower areas in broad daylight as kids and counselors were cleaning up, clad in his dirty overalls, mangled face, and now he took to carrying around this big hatchet. The tension in the room was growing, and there was a thump from outside, and I looked up in full attention. One of the kids spoke up. "What was that?" "Probably just Mr. Alessi coming back from the night out," I said. "Hey, let's scare him when he comes in." All the kids agreed, and we waited for the front door to open. But that didn't happen. Instead, the back door was thrown open, and I spun with my light to catch a man in overalls, holding a hatchet bursting through, and he was wearing a half-shattered goalie mask like Jason Voorhees. The campers screamed, and one, sadly, pissed his jammies right that second as the man rushed into the room. Score one for me and my fellow CIT, Tom, who had slid out of the cabin while I was telling my tale. We had planned the whole thing, and it was a triumphant success, except for Scott peeing himself and everyone being terrified for the rest of the week. Tom and I got a stern talking to by the head campmaster, but everyone, even the campers, did get a kick out of it, and they still talk about it to this day. Uncle Josh note. That was me and my childhood friends Tom and Scott. Tom was the older brother of one of my closest friends, and we all grew up 2 houses from one another in the same neighborhood. Scott was a year younger than me, but he also grew up with me in the church of my youth, but he was from a town over. Sadly, Scott was killed in 1997 in a car accident while on leave from his military duty from the Army. He was only 22. Tom took his own life in 2010. He was just 40 years old. Rest in peace, fellas.
Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode. If you have a true scary story of any nature that you'd like me to narrate, email it to unclejosh.truescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. If you're catching this on YouTube and you like what you heard and saw, why not give the video a thumbs up, share it with a friend, leave a comment. I'd love to know what you thought of the stories. It's all free and it all helps out with the algorithms, so I appreciate it. Follow me on social media, and if you'd like to take your support a step further, find a link to my Patreon page in the description and consider getting some Uncle Josh and Campfire Crew merchandise. A link to my TeePublic storefront is also in the description. Everyone, be excellent to each other, and until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything: a ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.